is back. This is sort of a three-part thing. I can't talk and chew gum at the same time. So I'm going to give a talk, and then after my talk I have some pictures to show. And then after the pictures I have a little thing to do with Dixie cups. So anyway, throughout the talk I'm going to talk about the Speculator Mine and the Granite Mountain Mine. I notice people talk about this disaster in several ways. Some people call it the North Butte mining disaster after the company. Some call it the Granite Mountain disaster because the actual fire took place in the Granite Mountain shaft. But the miners at the time called it the Speculator Mine. Elmer called it the Speculator Mine. That was the name of the mine. The Granite Mountain shaft was the newer shaft of the Speculator Mine. So anyway, as I talk, I'm going to intermix the names, but it's all one and the same thing. Anyway, without further ado, I'll start talking. It was so long ago, Elmer Miller and the Granite Mountain Fire. Clarence Miller walked to the station to get a bucket of water. He arrived just as his boss, John Hamill, stepped off the cage on the 1800 level of the Granite Mountain Mine. It was around midnight on the graveyard shift, not long after the miners' lunch. Clarence and Hamill talked for a bit about the electrical cable which had been lowered earlier that day. Hamill knew things hadn't gone as planned. Before he could explain the twisted cable to Clarence, they both saw smoke rising in the shaft. Hamill described it later as a very dark smoke, different than what you'd see from a wood fire. Within a minute, the black smoke filled the 1800 station. "I'll call the surface," Hamill said, but the phone lines were dead. So Hamill told Clarence to notify the men in the stopes on the 1800 that there was a fire in the Granite Mountain shaft. He thought Clarence could cover the half mile to the Speculator shaft in time enough to warn the men on the 1800. He had a plan then to gather those men and hurry them to the adjoining drifts of the Badger State Mine. From there, they could be hoisted to the surface and breathe fresh air. Bulkhead Jack, as he was called, knew he had other miners to worry about. His charges were also scattered on the 2,000 and 2,200 levels of the mine. One of them was Clarence Miller's younger brother, Elmer. "The smoke was following as fast as you could walk," Clarence said years later. "I wanted to go over to the Speculator shaft pretty bad, but Hamill called me back. The fire had already burnt out the electrical system in the mine, so there were no more lights at the station. Jack Hamill and Clarence Miller would have to find the others by shining their carbide lamps into the smoke that was spreading very fast." 22 years ago, I drove to St. Mary's, Idaho to meet a man named Harry Treelor. A friend of mine suggested the visit because he knew I loved Butte. Harry, it turned out, was the nephew of Sam Treelor, the director of the Butte Mines Band. He'd been born in McQueen and had grown up looking at the mines scattered across the Butte Hill. On a rainy afternoon, Harry and I talked for hours about Meterville and the Columbia Gardens, about the 18 flat cars of logs that went through the Bonner Mill each day to provide timber for the Butte Underground. He told me stories of Walkerville, of Copperwater, crosscuts, drifts, and raises. He talked about the miner's lamp which started a fire in the shaft of the Granite Mountain. He was only 9 months old at the time. Harry worked in the Granite Mountain during the 1940s, when the Anaconda Company reopened the mine during the Second World War. "I was honored to be there," Harry said. "You walked in the drifts of history, in Dugan's Drift. In the dry, there must have been 1,000 lockers. 160 of them or so were marked by crosses." He shook his head. "No one wants to put their clothes in a dead man's locker." If I were to tell you all of Harry's stories, you'd be wanting dinner before the tales ran out. His father working for Heinze in Lexington, an underground horse he knew named Emily, the beauty of rhodonite pink in the veins of the Emma mine. Harry told me it wasn't right for a miner to whistle in the drifts, but a miner could sing, he said, and you could hear the singing in the cages when the men came up at the end of their shift, a diminuendo as they rose. At the end of our chat, Harry offered to show me his model railroad set laid out on the top floor of his house. The electric train wound past villages, zipped through tunnels, and past a smokestack that resembled the one in Anaconda. It even had a sidetrack where freight cars split off the main line to pick up loads of ore from the mine yard. "It's the Leonard," Harry said, when he saw me studying his model mine planted near the railroad tracks. "I've got a working shaft." I looked closer. I could see the sheave wheels spinning on Harry's miniature head frame, the hoist lowering tiny miners to tunnels underground. I followed Harry down a flight of stairs, keeping my eyes on his shaft. It dropped through a hole in his floor, then emerged from the ceiling and downstairs hallway. In that hallway, there were more tunnels moving away from the shaft, like tentacles from the head of an octopus. We descended another set of stairs to Harry's basement, and I couldn't believe it. The shaft went all the way down there. Harry had miners working the stopes, climbing the raises, and loading ore into tiny rail cars in a model underground mine. "I've tried to make it all to scale," Harry said, "but to really get to the bottom of the mine, I'd need a second basement." Using the maps and charts over several years, Harry Treelor had created a three-dimensional model of the Leonard Mine that once stood in Meterville, walking distance from his childhood home in McQueen. Harry chattered about following a vein to get to the high-grade ore. He told me how a fire that started in the Leonard back in 1909 was still burning when he worked there in 1949. I just stared at his model mine, dazed at the three dimensions of his underground world. That afternoon, I began to understand something of the complexity of the ground beneath us, the ground right here. What you see on the surface of Butte is only a sliver of things, the short hairs on the top of a giant's head. What you see on the surface of the Granite Mountain Mine is only a sliver of things, too. Seeing Harry in Idaho reminded me of my first trip to the Butte-Silver archives. This was long before the remodel. When I walked in the door off the alley, then new archivist Ellen Crane greeted me with a "How you doing?" and a nod. She said, "Focus on your subject, Howard. Get in, get out. Don't get lost in the side rails." Fortunately, I didn't listen to Ellen that day. And I've been stumbling along the side rails of Butte history ever since. 1917, what a year. Butte's greatest population boom. Immigrants from many European nations. The mines working round the clock to get copper for the Great War. Draft protesters, miner strikes, Frank Little, and of course the event we remember this week, the Granite Mountain Speculator mine disaster. My friend Bill Moen, who once co-owned Butte Booksellers, told me he'd sell his soul to the devil to time travel back to Butte as it was in 1917. I'm not sure I'd go that far, but I do know it's hard for any of us to fully imagine the vitality, the bustle, the chaos of Butte 100 years ago today. I first read about the mine fire in Copper Camp, a grand piece of folklore on Butte history. Then, as a reference librarian, I dug for more. Newspapers on microfilm, a government report by Daniel Harrington, articles by Arnon Gutfeld and Beverly Brothers, mysterious letters and photographs in Al Hooper's basement. One question kept coming to my mind. Why hasn't anyone told this story? I mean, really told this story? For years, I dreamed of writing a book about the fire, but the side rails of my own life got in the way. Until Jerry Walter's efforts to build a monument to the fallen miners, there wasn't much around town to tell a visitor about this piece of Montana history. Michael Punk's book, Fire and Brimstone, has printed out many details, and this week you'll be hearing others with no greater love. But just like the nearly 40 miles of workings in the North Butte Mine, the story of the Granite Mountain is a labyrinth, a tale of hundreds of miners and their families. Can we follow all the underground drifts? I don't think we have yet. The North Butte Mining Company didn't want to publicize the fire. Local mining historian Al Hooper told me the managers in Butte wrote letters in code back to the corporate offices in New York, planning ways to control bad publicity. Ironworker John T. Shea said to me, "My dad didn't talk about the spec. You didn't talk about things like that. Mary McClafferty, daughter of station tender Con McClafferty, told me once, "My father only talked about the fire when he was drunk," and that wasn't too often. Mary's brother Jim showed me his father's Sacred Heart of Jesus medal, which Con had worn into the mine that night. At the last minute, Con McClafferty stepped off a cage because he felt a sensation in Jesus' heart against his chest. He stayed alive when fellow station tenders Mike Conroy and Pete Sheridan were dropped down the shaft into the fire and their deaths. Fran Lubick's father, Francis Curran, died in the Granite Mountain that night. His gravestone said Kern, K-E-R-N, Fran told me. That's the Scottish spelling, what the timekeeper wrote on his card. My mother was young, 16. She took the company payment and left town. I was raised by my grandparents. When I visited his apartment on Washington Street, John the Yank Harrington told me his cousin Maine had a boyfriend in the mine. So she took John and one of his sisters to look at the bodies outside the Sherman and Reed funeral home. Her boyfriend had been a rescue worker who went down to help with the rescue and got lost in the mine. The bodies were all lined up from Broadway to Granite Street. There were sheets over the bodies, John said. Maine pulled off the sheets to see the faces. She didn't find her boyfriend. The bodies smelled so bad. Then John the Yank picked up his accordion to play me tunes he remembered from his years in County Court. After one tune, the Yank said, "The whistles. They used to blow at 4:30, noon, and at night. A whistle would blow when there was a mine accident." Martin Lysick, the father of Ed Lysick, was one of the helmet men who descended into the mine after the fire. Terrible it was to pick up the poor men, pile them up on beds, and haul them to the surface, he told his son. Mr. Lysick survived the rescue work, but he died young too, a victim of miners' con. In a letter to Norman Brawley, superintendent of the North Butte Mine, the widow of J.D. Moore wrote, "I am aware of men's abhorrence for a hysterical woman, but since that awful accident, I have entirely lost my nerve and simply cannot speak of Mr. Moore with any degree of composure. We were all to each other, and I miss him so. And having no one of my own to whom I can turn, I break down occasionally when I should not." Sometimes I walk through the cemeteries of Butte, thinking about the fire. I meander, looking for graves of the miners. There are tombstones, weathered wooden markers, simple crosses, and a large monument at the Mountain View Cemetery, where the unidentified dead are buried. The Serbian graves often hold photos in porcelain, 100 years old, to preserve the images of men who once walked above ground. Then I ponder the story of people like John Ayres, who's buried under a simple wooden cross in the Mountain View. The cross reads 1879 to 1917, Speculator Fire. I know very little of Mr. Ayres. His name isn't on the list of the dead at the Granite Mountain Memorial. Above ground, only a cross remembers him. Sometimes I hear the wind weeping. But there's another side to the North Butte mine disaster that needs to be told. The story of the survivors. If 168 men died in the smoky dark, then 242 made it out alive. I was born 38 years after the fire, yet I had the honor of knowing one of the hard rock men who reached the surface safe that night, escaping the gas. In 1994, 77 years after the fire, I was astonished to hear Jerry Walter tell me there was one man who still remembered the fire. This wasn't a fellow who gaped over the fence when they were laying out bodies in the mine yard, or a fellow who'd collected all the newspaper articles and put them in a scrapbook. This was an actual miner, one who'd been working on the 2,000-foot level when the gas came rushing in with the smoke. His name was Elmer Miller. He was 96 years old and living in California. I knew I had to meet him. My opportunity came a year later, in July of 1995, when my travels brought me close to Sacramento and Elmer's home in Marysville. On a warm California morning, we were to meet for a chat about mining and that one great fire. Elmer answered his door with a smile. He gave me a friendly hello in his solid baritone voice. The man in front of me looked quite young for 97. At first, I thought it was his son or a caregiver who was greeting me. It couldn't be Elmer, someone who was 97. I've known people in their 60s who looked more beaten down, looked older. Elmer's face was warm and open. Though he used a cane to walk, he carried himself proudly. He stood quite straight. He was well dressed with a bolo tie and striped shirt. His wingtip shoes were buffed and polished. Perhaps I should have expected that from a man whose brother ran Miller's shoes. Elmer's manner was that of a gentleman in the finest true sense of the word. "Sit down," as he said, as I stood a little awkwardly on his living room rug. He motioned toward a chair. I'd expected a frail old guy tottering around a house, but Elmer started talking about the roses he was raising in his garden, and about his next trip to Reno to try the slots. He still owned a car and had passed his driver's exam recently without using glasses. He was proud of that. "It was so long ago," Elmer said of the fire. His eyes studied the family photographs on his living room wall, as if he remembered the thousands of days that had filled his life since that one June night in Butte. 3/4 of a century had gone by. We'd invented television, gone to the moon, and learned the wonders of the computer. When Elmer worked as a miner on the richest hill on earth, many folks in Montana still got around with horses. Elmer Miller was born in Iowa in 1898. He came from a farming family. His father worked as a harness maker and leather worker. "We were Pennsylvania Dutch," Elmer said. 1910 saw the Miller family living in Spokane. Later, they moved to Belgrade. His father brought the family to Butte in 1916, but not before his brother Clarence had seriously injured his leg in a combine accident. As Elmer says on the recording that can be played at the mine memorial up the hill, mining paid better than farming. Butte was an industrial giant, booming with copper needed for the war in Europe. So he and Clarence soon found jobs in the mines. Elmer's first job was at the tramway. He was only 17. There was a house at the gate, Elmer said, the doghouse, where miners lined up to work, often in the snow and the cold. Sometimes they'd hire only 2 or 3 of the whole lineup, whatever they needed that day, he said. Many of the men who stood outside those mine yard gates, hoping to rustle up work, were new immigrants. You could work in a mine even if you didn't speak the language. There were Finns, Irish, Italians, Serbs, hoping to work the stopes in Butte. And when they found work, they tried to save what they could from their paychecks to pay for a relative's boat trip across the Atlantic. That way, an entire family, one by one, could end up in Butte. Elmer was young, 5 foot 8 inches tall, and not as big as many of the miners. I remember Big Mike Connors, Elmer told me with a laugh, talking about one of the larger shift bosses. Connors took one look at me and said, "Who are you?" I stood up straight as I could, and I shouted, "I'm a miner!" Elmer grinned. I was just a young kid. I didn't know a thing. But I got a job. I thought I'd be fired the first night when they found out how little I knew. In his job at the tramway, Elmer worked as a gopher. "Go for this, go for that," he said. He was glad to be a roustabout, because as he went from place to place around the mine, he learned various aspects of an occupation he knew very little about. After 6 months at the tramway, Elmer went to work at the Granite Mountain. Bulkhead Jack Hamill was his first boss. Bulkhead Jack was a tall man, gruff, roughed, and single, a veteran of 20-plus years underground. Elmer's brother Clarence knew Bulkhead Jack, and Elmer knew that helped him get his job. The first man he worked with was another longtime miner, a fellow he first knew only as Charlie. The first day in the job, Bulkhead Jack asked Charlie, "Will he make a miner?" "I don't know, Jack, but I think he'll make a miner out of me," Charlie said. So Elmer began his career at the Granite Mountain. riding the cage as the mine's new electric hoist dropped him down, feeling the heat in the drifts, hearing the buzz of the drills. He worked as a nipper, providing tools and supplies for the miners in both the 1,800 and 2,000-foot levels of the mine, a third of a mile below the surface. He learned the details slowly and called himself a flunky. Just like Harry Treelor, Elmer quickly learned the miners' unwritten code that whistling was bad luck. It was hot work, Elmer said. I saw men soak through their knit shirts so quickly. I saw them take off their shirts and wring them out several times during a shift. The Granite Mountain was a dripper. The mine was humid with lots of water, constantly dripping. The water would give you copper sores. They hurt bad, but you got used to it. It could be 85 degrees underground and 20 below up on the surface. You felt the cold air filtering down on you when you came up the shaft at the end of your shift. Elmer got up from his seat in his house and walked across his living room. He pulled a metal object. Oh, I forgot it. Oh, I'll have to get it. Oh, no, it's not there.
I'm sorry to interrupt. It's very interesting. I'll be back for your next one.
It was hot work. Let's see. I had a prop here with a candle holder and a piece of wood. Maybe I'll run and get it. It's across the hallway. Anyway, I was going to show it right then. Anyway, he pulled a metal object off one of his bookshelves. I'll bet you don't know what this is, he said. I held the steel thing which had a point at one end, a curved hook in the middle, and a metal circle at the other. I actually couldn't conceive of its use. It's a candle holder, Elmer told me, explaining how the pointed end could be stuck in the timbers of a drift. The curved hook could fit over a hand, and the metal circle was just big enough to hold a candle. I knew the Granite Mountain shaft fire had been started by a carbide lamp, a small light that burned bright and hot. But Elmer told me many men in the mine preferred candles. They'd give you 4 a shift, he said, but you could get by on 3. I was like many of the old miners. I liked a candle better than a carbide lamp. If you put a candle in the timber, it could light things up for 30 or 40 feet. I could be a mucker and work on the drift, and then go back to the ore car and see it all well. Your eyes adjusted to the light. A candle shone well enough. The men didn't like carbide lamps because they just sat on your head and shone straight ahead. It was bright in one direction, but everything else was dark. The fire happened so fast, Elmer said, an edge to his voice. The bad air. The men on Elmer's level of the mine knew something was wrong when the electric lights in the main drift flickered, then went dark. Their power source burned by the flames. The poisonous gas mixed with the smoke moved rapidly away from the Granite Mountain shaft toward Elmer and the other miners in his section of the mine. Within minutes, the smoke was infecting all the drifts. It came out of the workings toward the shaft, Elmer told me, but that was where the fire was. It was quickly decided to try and get out through the high ore mine. As a nipper, I knew the way. None of the men I was with were scared. We just thought smoke, and we knew we had to get out fast. Elmer was familiar with the drifts, crosscuts, and raises on his levels of the Speculator mine. As a nipper, he had visited them all. He knew how they connected to the workings of the high ore, the diamond, and the Badger State. Better than many of the miners who'd actually been there for years. His knowledge came in handy in leading others to safety that night. The unused drift to the high ore was blocked by cave-ins. They were small, but we managed to get out to the shaft and up to the surface, he said. There were 5 or 6 of us. While Elmer was going to the high ore shaft on the 2200 level, his brother Clarence, along with Bulkhead Jack, went another route through the mine tunnel maze in the smoky dark. They had a hard time because their carbide lamps didn't have enough oxygen to burn. And with the smoke, it was impossible to see much anyhow. They had to go by feeling the sides of the drifts. With the guidance of another miner, they climbed 3 floors of manways, about 600 feet, to reach a drift that led to the clean air of the Badger State. They told the miners there of the spreading fire. Soon, everyone was hoisted to the surface, both the miners from the Granite Mountain and the night shift of the Badger State. 110 miners escaped out of the Badger State that night. Elmer met his brother Clarence above ground in the mine yard, near the timekeeper's house, not yet knowing how bad the fire was. They were near the collar of the Granite Mountain shaft when two station tenders, Mike Conroy and Peter Sheridan, were hoisted to the surface. The cages they rode in came up red hot. The engineer went to one of the men, and when he went to grab him, his arm fell off. It was then that I knew it was bad, Elmer said. The station tenders were covered by ashes, little left of them to recognize them as human, just their brass buttons. Elmer told me there was lots of smoke coming out of the shaft by then. The hoisting shaft had become a chimney. Smoke everywhere hinted at the fire below. Elmer soon learned that it was carbon monoxide gas, not heat or flames, that most threatened the miners. Clarence and Elmer Miller walked back to their house in Dakota Street that night, where they lived with their parents. They knew they were both lucky to have escaped the smoke and the gas. Some on the 1800 and 2000 levels of the mine, not too far from them, died. Greek miners working for Bulkhead Jack on the south side of the 1800 had run straight toward the Granite Mountain shaft and into the smoke, which asphyxiated them within minutes. Those miners probably thought the smoke signaled a repeat of the Modoc mine fire that had already emptied the Granite Mountain Mine twice in 1917. But bulkheads had been built to block the Modoc fire in a neighboring mine. Hamill thought that if not for the language barrier the Greeks had, they would have followed him to the Badger State. Miners from 13 countries and 8 states lost their lives because of the fire. For some, like John Bixby, it was their very first night underground. For others, like Alfred Tregonin, it was the end of a long work life spent in many mines. Fate worked in many ways. On Saturday morning, when the Millers returned to the mine, they saw the temporary morgue and discovered well over 100 of their fellow workers had been killed by the sweet damp of carbon monoxide. Bodies were being hauled to the surface while helmet men below hunted for survivors. With World War I, and with the mining foreman who'd inspected the electrical cable being of German descent, some of the workers said the whole thing was sabotage. But Elmer knew that was just a crazy rumor. It was just an awful accident. Stories flew through Butte during the summer of 1917 as thousands of miners hoped for better working conditions and better wages. Though only 5 men were found dead near the concrete bulkheads built to stop the Modoc fire, rumors increased those numbers dramatically. By the time Frank Little, the IWW leader, came to Butte in late July, the situation was tense. Clarence Miller went to hear Little speak at Lake Abaca the night before he died. Both he and Elmer saw Little's funeral, where thousands marched in procession to carry his body the 4+ miles to his grave at the Mountain View Cemetery. There was always trouble around the mines that summer when the strikes were on, Elmer said. Those were wild times. It was better to stay away and out of the trouble. I didn't realize how crazy a place Butte was until I left. That one guy, Little, they hung him from a railroad trestle. It was terrible. He shook his head, remembering. After the fire, after the funerals, after thousands of men walked off the job in the summer of 1917, Elmer knew he was still a miner. He worked at Shoemaker's Meats for a time, but eventually went back to the Granite Mountain to help repair the 1,500 feet of burned timbers in the shaft. His brother Clarence went to work with their father, the harness maker, as they founded Miller's Shoes, which until 4 years ago was run by Clarence Miller's relatives down in Arizona Street. I asked Elmer if it bothered him going back to a place where so many men had died. No, he said, it was a job. I needed the work. While the shaft was being repaired, there were only 50 men to a shift in the Granite Mountain. Elmer worked 6-hour shifts with no break, but got paid for 8. Rush work, he called it. The North Butte Mining Company was racing to reopen the mine. The smaller crew brought me up a long ways. At 19, I became a shift boss. I worked my way up to badge number 7, he said, the low number indicating higher seniority. By February 18, 1918, the Granite Mountain Mine was again in full operation. At that time, Jimmy Rogers, one of the craggy old-timers, looked at Elmer on the sheets before the beginning of a shift. He said, "A little fart like that? A foreman?" Elmer chuckled, remembering. "When I was working on rebuilding the timbers of the shaft, it was cold. You'd want to wear a heavy coat," Elmer said. "The air would downdraft in the shaft and blast you all winter. Sometimes near the stations, when you'd mine on shift, it'd be cold too. But back in the drifts, you'd be sweating. Then in the surface, you had to walk from the head frame to the dry, where you changed. And that was very cold." The Granite Mountain shaft was filled in with concrete, covering the timbers that had burned. The North Butte Mining Company wanted no more fires. Elmer made his mark working on the shaft repairs, then as a shift boss on the 600, 700, and 800 levels of the mine. He worked there until the Granite Mountain closed in 1923. A weekly paycheck was $45 a week. Elmer said, "First, I took the trolley to the Granite Mountain, but then I drove a Ford. I learned to drive by chauffeuring one of the other bosses in his car. I think he was afraid to do it himself. The man was used to horses. I became friends with many of the bosses as I drove, going fishing with some of them out at Divide. He winked as he remembered trips to the Wise River and the Big Hole. Elmer loved to fish. He was with a group of men after a fishing outing when he met his future wife. Maybe I shouldn't tell you this, Elmer said, but she looked pretty good to me. Elmer's eyes twinkled bright when he talked about his wife, Ella. She'd been gone for over a decade when I chatted first with him in 1995, but that morning he imagined her again as a young woman in Butte. Ella Malone was the daughter of parents from a Colorado mining town. Her mother delivered mail around North Creede, Colorado. On the wall of his study, Elmer showed me a photograph of Creede. My mother-in-law was a tough one, he said. When she was running the mail through the Colorado mountains, she was confronted by robbers. "I'll shoot you," she told the men as they approached her and the mail bags on the back of her horse. It was rugged country, far from town. The robbers didn't listen to Ella's mother. They kept on coming. So she pulled the pistol from her saddle and shot them both. No one robbed the mail that day in Creede. Elmer married Ella Malone in St. Mary's Church on September 4th, 1918. They found a house on Delaware Avenue, and Mr. Miller kept working for the North Butte Mining Company. When Elmer came back from his honeymoon, Mine Superintendent Norm Brawley said, "You missed a few shifts, Miller. Now you'll be able to work with no breaks." The Spanish influenza swept through Butte in the autumn of 1918. Over 1,000 people died in the epidemic. One of them was a priest at St. Mary's Church. With bad working conditions and immigrant houses built so close together, Butte was fertile ground for the flu. But Ella and Elmer survived. Still, it seemed like another hard blow, along with the soldiers who died overseas in the war and the miners who died underground. Through it all, Elmer kept working. He became a favorite of Norm Brawley. Elmer helped Brawley do experiments with canvas bags and fasteners, and eventually received a patent on a new coupling system. Brawley had the patent, not Elmer. Elmer followed the veins through the drifts and brought enticing ore samples to the manager. Brawley was impressed. Though he now used a carbide lamp, Elmer still liked his candles. He used one of them to heat up the pasties his wife Ella prepared for his lunch. He also lit candles for horses to charm them into pulling the ore cars. Elmer said, "The horses liked to see their way through the mine. They didn't like always pulling in the dark." Every Sunday, Elmer descended to the bottom of the shaft to visit a pump man who worked alone on the 3600 in the sump to keep the water level low in the mine. His name was Jasper, Elmer said. The rest of the men didn't work on Sunday, so I'd take him a newspaper every week. Jasper was always glad to see me and always thanked me for the newspaper. Those 3 big pumps were noisy down there, and it was hot 3,600 feet down. But after a while, I learned Jasper couldn't read or write. He never read the newspaper. He only wanted my company. One January day, the temperature was unusually cold in Butte. It snowed like the dickens that winter, fine sleet snow, 56 below zero. But I walked to the Pittsmont to keep a fire going, he said. Speaking of the day, he'd had to go several miles to work in a mine east of the Butte Hill. When he found no one else was at the mine, he called his boss, Mike Connors. Connors answered with a huff. "Who is this?" "It's Miller." "How the heck did you get to the Pittsmont?" Connors asked, knowing nothing was running in the extreme cold, certainly not the trolleys or the automobiles. "I walked," Elmer said, matter of fact, a way of speaking he still used in 1995. "Don't walk back, Miller. We'll pick you up," Connors told him. Elmer had become a shift boss, but he knew he didn't always want to be a miner. At night, he took the International Correspondence School to study electricity. Elmer's daughter told me her father was always reading, always learning. He had an uncle who lived in Wenatchee, Washington, so after 6 years at the Granite Mountain, Elmer was off to a new profession. He worked for 4 years in the Washington Appletown, then moved to California in Marysville. For 44 years, Elmer was one of the chief electricians there. He went from mining copper to working with copper wire. Marysville was good to Elmer. Referring to the contract jobs, he'd done thousands of them in California homes. He winked at me and said, "I might rob you." The corners of his mouth turned up with a smile, but somehow I didn't believe him. I'd be willing to bet a house wired by Elmer Miller would last for a long, long time. "I built my little blue house and electrical shop to last 5 years, he said. She lasted 44. Elmer and Ella Miller had 2 children, Billy and Peggy. I had the honor to meet Peggy several times during my trips to Marysville. Billy, however, drowned in a tragic accident when he was 10 years old. It was Father's Day, and the 2 of them had gone fishing in the foothills of the Sierra. I was told by his niece that it took years before Elmer really wanted to fish again. So even the man who escaped from the Granite Mountain shaft fire had his own family tragedy. In a quirky coincidence, while I researched the North Butte mine disaster, I discovered another Miller. His name was Ernest, no relation to Clarence or Elmer. Ernest was one of the 242 who safely exited the Granite Mountain. But after he found his way through the Badger State, Ernest Miller decided he wanted nothing more to do with the North Butte Mining Company. So Ernest Miller moved to California and started working in the Argonaut Gold Mine near Jackson. But on August 27, 1922, 5 years after the Granite Mountain shaft fire, Ernest Miller found himself in the middle of another underground blaze. 3 weeks later, his body, along with 45 others, was found behind the 2 bulkheads the men had built in an attempt to keep out the gas. Fate will find you, I guess. While his brother Clarence, living 1,000 miles away, worked a shoe store a few blocks from Chinatown, Elmer's electric shop happened to be close by a Chinese block too. Since he was an electrical contractor, Elmer wired the card tables in Marysville's Chinese joints. He wired them cleverly enough so that when Sheriff McCoy came around, the gamblers could flick the lights off over the card table to let everyone know the sheriff was near. While we ate lunch one day, Elmer gave me a gambling tip with his napkin. He folded it just so to demonstrate how anyone playing cards could quickly cover their money in chips, so no one would know. To the end of his life, Elmer liked to play Keno in Reno. He reminded me the Nevada game was really a Chinese game, modified in Butte for European miners. When I asked him if he ever got caught when a police raid came to Chinatown, he said, "No, I wasn't there to play cards. I was there to work on the electrical system." It had to be just right for Chinatown, you know. They have lots of lights. Visiting Elmer in the 1990s, I started to realize that all of our lives can be more than the disasters or disappointments that might shape them. Elmer faced the horrors of the Spec Fire, then moved on. He faced the loss of his son at the age of 10, but drew close to his wife Ella and his daughter Peggy. In his mid-90s, he was still growing roses in his garden. As I said goodbye to Elmer after our first visit, I began to think how good can come from bad. In an odd sort of way, I knew I would have never met Elmer Miller without the story of the Granite Mountain Mine disaster. But now that we met, I wanted to talk to him about life, not death. About California peaches, fishing in the Wise River, and his gardening. Elmer was curious about my years growing up in Wenatchee, since he'd lived there too. We chatted about the hazards of underground mining, but we also talked playing cards, apple varieties, and trip to Reno, where the slot machines never treated Elmer as well as he wanted them to. Mr. Miller asked me after that visit when I'd be in Butte again. Soon, I said. You know, I have one more story to tell you, he whispered as we stood on his front porch. He had his mischievous grin. I had high-top boots when I worked in the mines. They kept out the water and the damp. I told you the Granite Mountain was a dripper. After work, I liked to play cards with some of my coworkers. It was a good way to end a shift, even though Mrs. Miller did not approve. Some days I won a bit of money from the other shift bosses. One day it was quite a bit of money. Anyway, a vaudeville troupe comes to Butte that same week, and they all end up at my brother Clarence's shoe store, needing some high-top leather boots to perform their act on stage. Clarence says, I don't have any in stock, but my brother Elmer has a pair of high-top boots. He always wears them. So these vaudevillians go over to my house, and Ella heads to the closet to get my boots. When she picks them up and turns them over, all my gambling coins fell out. Everything I'd won. Oh, I had to lay low after that. Elmer laughed. A man can't be lucky every time. Thank you. I realize I messed up on two things.
I don't love it.
Anyway, I'm going to show a bunch of pictures right now and go through the pictures I have, photographs I have. This is just an artsy picture of the Granite Mountain head frame. This is, I probably shouldn't show this. I debated whether Jerry Walter would be here today. This is one of Elmer Miller's bricks up at the Granite Mountain. And Elmer said, well, if the bricks are on the ground, won't people step on them and wear them out? And here's a little patch. And I thought, oh, Jerry's going to be mad at me for showing this picture. But anyway, there's now another one up here with his brother Clarence and Elmer right next to each other that's in much better condition. This is a picture, a newspaper picture of Elmer and Clarence that was in the Butte Miner a few days after the fire. It tells a story. It's very interesting to me. I had the luxury of reading the coroner's inquest, 500 and something pages of it this winter. And in that inquest, Bulkhead Jack Hamill says this story is a bunch of bunk. That what they described happening didn't happen. That it was an incorrect story about Clarence and Elmer. So, who knows? That's just a closer picture. Oh, Elmer was the shorter one, Clarence was the taller one in this copy from the newspaper. This is sort of Butte as it looked in 1917. This is actually, this house is still here. This is the house on Dakota Street where the Millers lived at the time of the fire. One of the things that surprised me when I was researching this is the Millers and a lot of miners moved a lot. Some of them lived in boarding houses. I'm not quite sure why, but often I found a number of addresses for the Miller family. But anyway, this was the house on Dakota Street where they lived in June of 1917. These are ubiquitous in Butte. This is a stock certificate for the North Butte Mining Company. One of the things I hope to do, and I'm going to try to do a little bit with Dixie cups, is one of the things that I think is amazing, and maybe you're all Butte old-timers and you all have it all figured out, the drifts, the veins, the tunnels, under this ground we're standing on are incredible in their complexity. This isn't a very good picture, but you see Butte on the top, and I don't have it, but these are all shafts, and the little black hole dip there is the Berkeley pit. And if you look at that, you see how small the pit is in relation to the mines. This is actually, I didn't really talk about him, but this is a freighter named after Thomas J. Cole, who owned the North Butte Mining Company. There was a very strong disparity, certainly in wealth. Mr. Cole had this huge freighter. He was in New York during the time of the fire. This is a photograph of the Granite Mountain. This is sort of a posed postcard of men working underground. Oh, I went back. A guy by the name of Jack Davidson gave me this photo and said this was, and I've tried, but I don't know what shaft this is. But this is smoke coming up out of another shaft after the Granite Mountain Mine disaster from a neighboring mine. And this is just a little bit of smoke coming out. Some of the descriptions talk about flames jumping up above the surface, but as far as I can verify, the fire ended about 600 feet down, so all people saw was a lot of smoke. The fire was down below. This is a picture of the high ore mine, which is the mine Elmer went to get away from the fire.
Was that east, west, north?
The high ore was south.
South.
That's what I'm going to try to do with the Dixie cups. I'm going to try to show the relationship of all the mines. This is the Badger State Mine, which is still up there. This is actually the most common way of escape for people that night. Probably there were 242 survivors. 110 of them or more got out through the Badger State. Oops. This is the Granite Mountain as it is today. This is the Bell Diamond. I'm told that actually at the time it was just the diamond mine and the Bell mine was separate. They more recently put them together. Con O'Neill was the manager of the diamond mine. He was sound asleep at the time of the fire, got up, went down to check on his men, and then he is one of the ones who died. Sound asleep in bed in his house.
That was my grandfather.
Who said that?
This is another picture of the Granite Mountain. The mine memorial is beautiful. I just went up there this morning. It looks better every time I come to visit Butte. But sometimes I wish there was a path right to the head frame. It's very powerful to be right there. This is one of the things that fascinates me, and one of the reasons I never wrote a book about the Granite Mountain Speculator Mine disaster, is there are so many stories to be told. And I feel like I don't know them all yet. And I discovered this grave about a year ago, and it says, killed, Speculator Fire. What I could figure out, what I learned is this Mr. Ayers didn't die in June. He died in September of 1917 at Warm Springs, Montana. And the possible explanation is that his lungs may have been damaged and he was so traumatized by the mine accident that he died several months later at the mental hospital there. This is just a picture of the Frank Little being carried that the Miller brothers both shot. One of my favorite things to do at Miller's Shoes, I must admit, I like cats. And I love to go and say hello to their cats, Sunshine and Mojo. I really did. This is a picture of repair work on the Granite Mountain shaft. And you can kind of tell, the flash sort of obliterates things, but you can kind of tell how wet they are trying to do repair work in the shaft. The other thing I think is interesting is you can see the high-top boots that this one man has on. One of the things I always wondered is why didn't more people talk about the fire? And oops, I jumped. Anyway, that last picture was soldiers marching in World War I. And I realized perhaps one of the reasons the monument didn't get built in 1917 was because of the war going on, was because of the Spanish flu that really hit Butte hard a year later. This is a picture of the Pitts mine that Elmer walked to on a cold winter morning. This is a picture of actually my hometown. Oops. What am I doing?
Pushing too hard, Howard.
This is a picture of my hometown of Wenatchee, Washington. And I think one of the reasons Elmer and I became friends, not just somebody I interviewed, was because we both had a connection to Wenatchee. And I learned just this week that his brother Don lived about a block and a half from where I grew up and sold cars in Wenatchee. His parents are both buried in Wenatchee. I think in some ways one of the best times to visit the Granite Mountain Memorial is on a winter day, because if it's really cold, there's going to be steam rising from the mine, and you can almost imagine smoke rising from the head frame, and get a sense, thinking about the fire in a world underground that's so different than on the surface. This is a picture of, this is one of the cages on the Granite Mountain on a winter's day. This is me with Elmer Miller in 1995. This was taken by his daughter Peggy. We were talking, so he was showing me some pictures here. And this is Elmer Miller. That's all I have.